Workers, comrades, and all who feel the weight of chains they did not forge, listen closely, for the world you walk through is not the world you believe you see. Behind every calm street, every ordinary day, every routine of labor and exhaustion, there beats a brutal truth. Your silence is the profit of your oppressor. The ruling class depends on nothing more than your quiet suffering, your resignation, your belief that nothing can change. For the moment you speak, the moment you question, the moment you unite, the machinery of domination trembles. You live in a system that has perfected the art of turning human beings into instruments. Capitalism feeds on your labor while convincing you that you owe it gratitude. It demands your obedience, your time, your strength, and then sells you the illusion of freedom while draining the substance of your life. And yet many endure this silently, believing their struggles personal rather than systemic, believing their pain an individual burden rather than a collective condition. This silence is not neutrality, it is surrender. And every moment you remain silent, oppression grows stronger, more sophisticated, more entrenched. The ruling class has always understood something that too many workers forget. Control is not maintained by force alone. It is maintained by shaping consciousness. If you accept exploitation as natural, they never have to justify it. If you believe inequality is inevitable, they never have to defend it. If you convince yourself that resistance is futile, they have already won. Capitalism's greatest victory is not the wealth it extracts, it is the silence it creates. But understand this: the wealth of the few is built entirely upon the labor of the many. Every factory, every field, every office, every road, every piece of technology, none exist because a capitalist imagined them, but because workers produced them. You are the living engine of society, yet you are treated as replaceable components. The ruling class accumulates fortunes beyond imagination, while workers struggle to survive on the scraps of their own creation. This contradiction is not accidental, it is the essence of capitalism itself. Still, the greatest danger is not that the ruling class exploits you. It is that you begin to think this exploitation is all you deserve. The chains that bind you most tightly are not made of iron but of ideology, beliefs planted by those who benefit from your silence. They tell you to be patient. They tell you to be grateful. They tell you that speaking out is dangerous, that demanding justice is unreasonable, that organizing is radical. Of course, they say this, your voice threatens their power. Every historical victory of the oppressed began with a refusal to remain silent. When workers recognize their shared condition, when they speak the truth of their exploitation, when they organize, capital trembles. The ruling class fears nothing more than the moment the workers look at one another and see not isolated individuals but a collective force. For once consciousness awakens, once the truth becomes clear, silence collapses, and with it collapses the power that fed upon it. You must understand, no oppressor relinquishes power voluntarily. The institutions of capitalism, its governments, its police, its media, its employers, are all constructed to preserve the dominance of those who profit from your labor. They will not reform themselves out of existence. They will not dismantle the structures that enrich them. Only the organized will of the oppressed can bring about transformation. And yet, even now, the ruling class counts on your hesitation. They hope you will convince yourself that your voice does not matter, that your actions are too small, that unity is impossible. But history has proven again and again that the collective power of the working class is the only force capable of overturning exploitation. The moment workers speak together, move together, demand together, the world shifts beneath the feet of the powerful. So I say to you, your silence is not harmless, it is the very breath of oppression. The price of your quiet is paid in your time, your dignity, your future. But the moment you decide to speak, to question, to unite with those who share your struggle, the entire edifice of domination begins to crack. You are not powerless. You are not alone. You are the makers of history, the producers of the world's wealth, the force that can reshape society from its foundations. Raise your voice. Break your silence. For the future belongs not to those who rule in your name, but to those who refuse to be ruled at all. Silence sustains the power of the ruling class because it allows the existing order to operate without resistance, without challenge, and without exposure. When workers and the oppressed remain quiet, the structures that exploit them function smoothly, uninterrupted by the friction of dissent. The ruling class has always relied on this quiet submission, for the system they maintain is neither natural nor just. It is a constructed hierarchy built upon centuries of inequality, exploitation, and concentrated ownership. Silence is the oxygen that keeps this hierarchy alive, because so long as the oppressed do not speak, the ruling class never has to justify its authority or confront the contradictions that underlie its power. It is easier to dominate a population that believes nothing can change than one that dares to question why things are the way they are. In every capitalist society, silence is cultivated as carefully as profit. Workers are taught to keep their grievances private, to endure exploitation quietly, to blame themselves for systemic problems, and to see each other as competitors rather than comrades. This silence turns collective suffering into isolated experience, preventing the recognition that millions share the same pain. When each person believes their struggle is individual, their silence becomes a barrier that separates them from the broader class reality. This is precisely what the ruling class desires. For a fragmented working class cannot form a unified movement capable of challenging the economic order. Silence, therefore, is not merely an absence of speech. It is a social condition beneficial to those who own the means of production, allowing them to shape not only the economy, but also the consciousness of those who sustain it through their labor. The ruling class reinforces this silence through institutions that normalize inequality. Schools teach obedience and conformity more than critical thought, encouraging students to internalize the values of capitalism and to accept the authority of those deemed more successful. Media outlets owned by powerful interests shape narratives that divert attention from systemic exploitation, focusing instead on individual failures, celebrity distractions, or superficial political conflicts. Workplace hierarchies discourage questioning of the boss, rewarding compliance and punishing dissent. Even the legal system functions as a guardian of silence, criminalizing protest, undermining worker organization, and protecting private property above human needs. Each of these institutions serves to deepen the quiet, to make the exploitation of workers appear as a natural and unchangeable reality. Silence also strengthens the ruling class because it allows exploitation to remain hidden behind the illusions of freedom and opportunity. Capitalism presents itself as a system where anyone can succeed if they simply work hard enough. This ideology suppresses resistance by making individuals believe that their failures are personal rather than structural. If workers accept this myth, they are less likely to speak against the inequality that defines their lives. The ruling class thrives on this myth, for it masks the fact that the wealth of the few is built upon the labor of the many, and that the opportunity celebrated by capitalism is accessible only to those already positioned above others. Silence permits this false narrative to stand unchallenged, strengthening the ideological hold of the ruling class over society. Moreover, silence prevents solidarity. When workers do not speak about their conditions, they remain unaware of the shared nature of their struggles. They fail to recognize that their long hours, low wages, job insecurity, and lack of control over their labor are not personal burdens but class-wide realities produced by the capitalist system. Without speaking, without sharing their experiences, they cannot build the collective identity necessary for resistance. The ruling class knows that worker unity is the beginning of its downfall, which is why it benefits immensely from the quiet acceptance of suffering. As long as workers remain silent, they remain isolated, and as long as they remain isolated, the structure of exploitation remains secure. Silence also allows the ruling class to refine and evolve its methods of control. Without open criticism, capitalist institutions can adjust policies, intensify exploitation, and expand their influence without fear of organized pushback. The absence of resistance becomes a green light for the ruling class to pursue greater profit at the expense of human dignity. In this way, silence becomes complicity, not because the oppressed choose it willingly, but because the system has conditioned them to believe that speaking out is dangerous, futile, or pointless. By keeping the masses quiet, the ruling class ensures that every injustice can deepen, every inequality can widen, and every mechanism of control can grow more sophisticated. Silence sustains the power of the ruling class, because silence is the denial of class consciousness. When workers do not speak, they do not see the system that exploits them, and when they do not see the system, they cannot resist it. The ruling class depends on this quiet to maintain its dominance, for it knows that the moment workers raise their voices, the illusion of capitalist inevitability begins to crumble. Without silence, exploitation can no longer hide behind the facade of normalcy, and the hierarchy that profits from it loses its stability. Capitalism depends on workers accepting exploitation as natural, because the entire system rests on a profound contradiction that would collapse the moment workers recognize it clearly. The worker produces far more value than they ever receive in wages. Yet the capitalist class captures this surplus as profit. This theft is disguised as a fair exchange only because workers have been conditioned to see it as normal. If they accepted the truth that their labor creates all wealth while they receive only a fraction of it, the ideological foundation of capitalism would shatter. Therefore, capitalism must cultivate a worldview in which exploitation appears not as exploitation but as an ordinary fact of life, a routine, an unquestioned rhythm of existence. From the moment a person enters the labor market, they are taught to believe that selling their labor power is a necessity, a responsibility, even a moral duty. They are told that work is virtue, that wages reflect merit, and that those who earn more simply deserve more. These narratives mask the reality that wages are not a measure of worth but a mechanism of control, designed to keep the worker dependent on the employer. The worker, through years of repetitive conditioning, internalizes the idea that long hours, low pay, and limited autonomy are simply the way things are. Capitalism thrives on this resignation, for a worker who believes exploitation is inevitable will not resist it. Capitalist society reinforces this acceptance through all its institutions. Schools emphasize obedience, punctuality, and the pursuit of individual success while ignoring the economic structures that predetermine outcomes. Students learn to follow rules rather than question systems, preparing them for a lifetime of workplace submission. Media narratives glorify wealth, celebrating the capitalist as a visionary genius while portraying workers as replaceable components of an economic machine. These portrayals serve to naturalize hierarchy, making the capitalist appear indispensable and the worker's suffering insignificant. Even popular culture promotes the illusion that success is solely the result of personal effort, thereby blaming the exploited for their exploitation. The workplace itself becomes a microcosm of capitalist ideology. Workers are expected to be grateful for employment, even when conditions are harsh and wages insufficient. They are pressured to compete with one another, to avoid speaking out, to prioritize survival over dignity. Managers encourage loyalty to the company, urging workers to internalize the goals of the employer as if they were their own. This manipulation of consciousness is essential because capitalism cannot function if workers perceive themselves as an exploited class. It requires individuals who see their own exploitation as self-chosen necessity, not as systemic coercion. By normalizing exploitation, capitalism maintains the illusion that the capitalist and the worker enter the labor relationship as equals. The employer is cast as a benefactor who provides jobs, while the worker is seen as a recipient of opportunity rather than the true creator of value. This inversion of reality is necessary to justify inequality, for if the worker understood that they are the engine of all production, the capitalist's role would appear parasitic rather than productive. The acceptance of exploitation ensures that workers continue to fuel the system that oppresses them, believing they owe gratitude to those who profit from their labor. Moreover, capitalism masks exploitation by embedding it in the everyday struggle for survival. When a worker must labor simply to afford food, housing, and basic needs, there is little energy left to question the system that forces them into this cycle. Economic insecurity becomes a tool of discipline, ensuring that fear keeps workers silent. This fear is so normalized that workers often defend the very system that exploits them, assuming that any alternative would be worse. Capitalism's greatest triumph is turning the exploited into defenders of their own exploitation. Capitalism also relies on the idea that exploitation is temporary, that anyone can escape if they work hard enough. This myth of social mobility keeps hope alive, even when evidence shows that the vast majority remain trapped in the same class position. The dream of upward mobility makes exploitation appear as a stepping stone rather than a trap, convincing workers to tolerate injustice in pursuit of a future that most will never reach. This false promise keeps the system stable, preventing workers from recognizing that structural inequality is designed, not accidental. Acceptance of exploitation is further sustained by the fragmentation of the working class. Workers are divided by race, nationality, gender, and countless other categories, preventing them from seeing their shared condition. These divisions create the illusion that exploitation affects some more than others, or that certain groups deserve their suffering. But these divisions are tools of the ruling class, carefully maintained to prevent unity. When workers see each other as competitors rather than comrades, exploitation becomes individualized, and the system remains unquestioned. Capitalism depends on workers accepting exploitation as natural, because without this acceptance, its moral legitimacy collapses. If people understood that their labor is the foundation of all wealth, that the capitalist extracts surplus from them, that inequality is engineered, not accidental, the system would be unmasked. Capitalism must therefore penetrate consciousness, shaping how workers see themselves, their labor, and their place in society. It survives not through consent freely given, but through consent manufactured over generations, until exploitation feels as ordinary as breathing, and resistance seems unimaginable. Consciousness and unity are the greatest threats to oppression because the power of any ruling class depends not only on its ability to control material resources, but also on its capacity to shape how people understand their own condition. Oppression thrives when individuals see their suffering as isolated, accidental, or personally deserved. It collapses the moment they recognize that their struggles are collective, systemic, and rooted in a common source. Consciousness is the awakening to this truth, the moment when illusions dissolve and the oppressed see the machinery that governs their lives. Unity is the natural consequence of this awakening, for once people understand that their suffering is shared, they begin to act together, and collective action is the one force that no oppressive system can withstand. Consciousness is dangerous to oppression because it reveals the hidden relations of power that sustain exploitation. The ruling class depends on mystification, on the belief that inequality is natural, that hierarchy is inevitable, and that the existing order is the only possible world. It works tirelessly to instill this worldview in the minds of the oppressed, using schools, media, workplaces, and political institutions to normalize injustice. But when people begin to think critically about their conditions, when they compare their lived reality to the promises of society, they see the contradictions that those in power want to hide. They understand that poverty in the midst of abundance is not fate but structural design, that exploitation is not accidental but deliberate, and that their labor enriches others more than it enriches themselves. This clarity is an act of rebellion because it strips the ruling class of the ideological veil that shields it from scrutiny. The moment consciousness spreads from one individual to another, oppression faces its first real threat. Isolated awareness is powerful, but collective awareness is transformative. When workers talk to one another about their conditions, when they share experiences of exploitation, when they notice the patterns that define their lives, they begin to see themselves not as solitary victims, but as members of a class whose interests are opposed to those who rule over them. The ruling class fears this development more than any weapon, because class consciousness transforms a fragmented population into a force with shared purpose. Once workers recognize their common exploitation, they start to question the legitimacy of the institutions that maintain it, and questioning is the first step toward revolt. Unity intensifies this threat by turning consciousness into action. The oppressed may suffer silently for generations, but once they organize, they discover their collective strength. Unity means that workers no longer accept the myths that divide them, myths based on race, religion, nationality, skill level, or economic status. These divisions are tools manufactured to weaken solidarity and keep people fighting among themselves instead of confronting their true oppressors. But when unity overcomes division, oppression begins to lose its foundation. The ruling class cannot buy off everyone, intimidate everyone, or deceive everyone at once. A unified working class becomes a force that can strike, disrupt, resist, and ultimately reorganize society in its own interests. Unity undermines oppression because it transforms the exploited from passive subjects into active agents of history. Oppression depends on people believing they have no power, that their individual actions cannot change anything. But unity reveals the opposite truth, that the entire system depends on their labor, their obedience, and their participation. When workers act together, they realize that they can stop production, shut down industries, overturn laws, and challenge political power directly. The ruling class, despite its wealth and institutions, cannot function without the cooperation of the masses. Unity exposes this vulnerability, and once exposed, it becomes a weapon in the hands of the oppressed. Consciousness and unity also create a horizon of possibility that oppression cannot survive. Oppressive systems rely on the belief that alternatives do not exist, that the current order is eternal. Consciousness breaks this illusion by showing that every system in history has been built by human hands and can be dismantled by them. Unity provides the organizational capacity to bring those alternatives into being. Together, they turn despair into determination, resignation into resistance, and suffering into solidarity. They transform the oppressed from objects of history into its authors. The ruling class understands that a population that sees clearly and stands together is unstoppable. This is why it invests so much in propaganda, division, repression, and distraction. It fears consciousness because consciousness reveals truth. It fears unity because unity creates power. But no amount of manipulation can forever suppress the awakening of the oppressed, for every act of exploitation contains within it the seed of awareness, and every shared struggle contains the seed of solidarity. When these seeds take root, oppression faces a force greater than any institution, a people who know their power and refuse to stand alone. The working class creates all wealth yet receives the least from it because the structure of capitalism is built on the extraction of surplus value, the unpaid labor that flows directly into the pockets of the ruling class. Every commodity, every service, every piece of infrastructure, every building and tool emerges from the hands, minds, and coordinated effort of workers. Without their labor, society would come to a halt instantly. Yet, despite being the foundation on which the entire economic system rests, workers are systematically deprived of the full value they produce. This is not an accident or a flaw in capitalism, it is its essential mechanism. The capitalist class positions itself as the owner of the means of production and uses this ownership to appropriate the majority of the wealth created by others. Workers sell their labor power in exchange for wages. But these wages represent only a fraction of the value they create. The difference between what the worker produces and what they receive in compensation is the source of capitalist profit. This surplus is taken by those who contribute no labor themselves, but own the factories, machines, technology, and resources. The capitalist enriches themselves by paying the worker less than the value of their work, ensuring that inequality is structurally embedded in the system. Workers are thus trapped in a cycle where the more they produce, the more wealth accumulates in the hands of their employers, while their own living conditions remain stagnant or deteriorate. This exploitation is often masked behind the illusion of fair exchange, as if wages and profit emerge from equal contributions. In reality, the capitalist contributes only ownership, while the worker provides the creativity, effort, skill, and physical energy necessary to bring commodities into existence. Without workers, machines are silent, raw materials remain untouched, and no wealth is produced. Yet workers are taught to believe that capital is the driving force of production, as though money or ownership alone generates value. This ideological distortion hides the truth that the capitalist is dependent on the worker, not the other way round. The working class sustains the system, but the system denies them the fruits of their labor. The distribution of wealth reflects this injustice. While workers struggle to afford basic necessities, the capitalist class accumulates fortunes so vast that they exceed any reasonable measure of human need. The wealthiest individuals and corporations extract massive profits from labor-intensive industries, and these profits grow precisely because workers do not receive the full compensation for what they produce. This concentration of wealth allows the ruling class to further entrench its power, influencing politics, media, education, and culture to protect the very system that enables its enrichment. Inequality is not a peripheral problem, it is the fundamental product of a system designed to ensure that those who produce wealth remain dependent on those who appropriate it. The working class receives the least from its own labor, partly because it lacks control over the means of production. Ownership determines who decides how wealth is distributed, how workplaces are run, and whose interests are prioritized. Since workers do not control the factories, the technologies, or the land, they have no decision-making authority over the value they create. Decisions about wages, working conditions, technological changes, and investment are made by capitalists whose primary goal is to maximize profit. As long as ownership remains concentrated, the working class remains excluded from the full value of its labor. Furthermore, the capitalist system perpetuates a state of competition among workers that keeps wages low and conditions precarious. By maintaining a reserve army of labor, unemployed or underemployed, people eager for jobs, the ruling class ensures that workers cannot demand higher pay without risking replacement. This instability is essential to the capitalist's power. It keeps workers afraid of losing their livelihood and discourages them from challenging exploitation. Insecure workers focus on survival rather than organizing for justice, allowing wealth to continue flowing upward without resistance. Even technological advancements, which should reduce the burden of labor and increase the well-being of workers, are used to intensify exploitation. Machines and automation increase productivity, enabling workers to produce more value in less time. But instead of sharing this increased wealth with those who produce it, capitalists claim it entirely as profit. Workers face speed-ups, reduced job security, and stagnant wages even as their productivity reaches historic heights. The result is a paradox. Workers become more productive yet poorer relative to the wealth they generate, while the ruling class grows richer at unprecedented rates. The working class creates all wealth yet receives the least from it because capitalism transforms human labor into a commodity to be bought cheaply and exploited thoroughly. The system offers no path for workers to reclaim the value they produce unless they challenge the power structure itself. As long as labor remains subordinate to capital, inequality will deepen and the majority will continue to live in the shadow of the wealth they themselves created. The reality is unmistakable. The world runs on the labor of workers, but workers do not run the world. Only organized, collective action can dismantle oppressive systems because oppression is never the work of a single individual, but the construction of an entire structure that defends the interests of the ruling class. This structure is reinforced by laws, institutions, economic power, cultural norms, and ideologies that together maintain the dominance of those who benefit from exploitation. No isolated act of resistance, no matter how brave, can overcome a system designed to absorb dissent and punish those who resist alone. Oppression functions like a fortress. Its walls are too thick for solitary efforts, but they crack under the pressure of unified force. Collective action transforms scattered anger into organized power, turning isolated suffering into a coordinated movement capable of challenging the foundations of domination. Organized action matters because the ruling class itself is organized. Capitalists do not operate as fragmented individuals. They coordinate through corporations, political alliances, financial institutions, and state power. They defend their interests collectively because they understand that their wealth and control depend on solidarity among the elite. To confront such a coordinated force, workers cannot remain divided, passive, or isolated. The oppressed must mirror this coordination by building their own structures of resistance, unions, councils, assemblies, movements, spaces where their shared interests become a unified strategy. Only through collective organization do the oppressed gain the capacity to counter the concentrated power of the ruling class. Oppressive systems rely heavily on the fragmentation of the working class. They thrive when workers see each other as competitors rather than comrades, when they are divided by race, nationality, gender, religion, or skill level. These divisions weaken solidarity and prevent workers from recognizing their common exploitation. Organized, collective action overcomes these divisions by forging a shared identity rooted in class. It creates the understanding that the struggles of one group are inseparable from the struggles of all. When workers unite across artificial boundaries, oppression faces a threat it cannot easily deflect. A system built on divide and rule begins to falter when the divided refuse to remain separate. Collective action also allows the oppressed to reclaim agency. Oppression teaches people that they are powerless, that the system is too large to challenge, and that resistance is futile. This psychological dominance is one of the ruling class's greatest weapons. But when people act together, striking, marching, organizing, they experience their power firsthand. A single worker cannot stop production, but a unified workforce can shut down entire industries. A lone protester cannot force political change, but millions standing together can reshape the very foundation of society. Collective action turns fear into confidence, resignation into determination, and silence into a voice that can no longer be ignored. Organization transforms resistance from spontaneous bursts of anger into sustained struggle. Oppressive systems are resilient. They can withstand isolated protests or short-lived uprisings. But organized resistance builds institutions of struggle that persist beyond immediate moments of conflict. Unions, worker committees, and grassroots organizations provide structure, strategy, and continuity. They allow movements to learn, adapt, and grow stronger over time. They preserve collective memory so that each generation does not have to begin its struggle from zero. Organization ensures that the fight against oppression is not a moment but a movement, not a reaction but a force capable of shaping history. The ruling class understands the danger of collective action, which is why it invests so much effort in suppressing it. Anti-union laws, police repression, propaganda against social movements, and the cultivation of individualism all serve to weaken unity. Oppressive systems fear the moment workers recognize their collective strength, for that is the moment when authority begins to lose its legitimacy. A unified working class exposes the truth that the ruling class depends on the labor, cooperation, and obedience of the masses. Once this truth becomes widely understood, the foundations of oppression begin to crumble. Collective action is also the only means by which the oppressed can seize control over the means of production, the source of all economic power. Liberation requires not only protest but the capacity to reorganize society on a different foundation. This requires democratic control over workplaces, resources, and institutions, something made possible only through organized effort. A society transformed cannot arise spontaneously. It must be constructed through the deliberate, coordinated work of millions who share the vision of a world free from exploitation. Collective action provides the blueprint and the force needed to turn such a vision into reality. Only organized, collective action can dismantle oppressive systems because oppression is upheld by collective power at the top, and only collective power from below can challenge it. When the oppressed unite, they become not merely a crowd but a class, not merely a group but a force. Their unity becomes the catalyst through which old structures fall and new possibilities emerge, created not by the few who once ruled, but by the many who once bore the weight of their rule. In the end, the truth stands unmistakable. Oppression does not endure because the ruling class is powerful, but because the working class has been taught to forget its own strength. Silence keeps exploitation invisible, acceptance turns injustice into routine, and division allows the few to dominate the many. But the moment workers awaken to their condition, the moment they see that all wealth flows from their hands while others claim its rewards, the foundations of the system begin to tremble. Consciousness exposes the lie that inequality is natural. Unity breaks the chains that keep people isolated, and organized action transforms scattered suffering into unstoppable force. The world has always been shaped by those who labor, not those who own, and the future will belong to those who recognize this power and wield it together.